ultimately, every time we talk about an uneven distribution of an economic resource, we are bringing to the table some theory about what a just allocation or process of creation of these inequalities are. So it's inherently political.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this is Colloquy, bringing knowledge from the university's PhD community to top-of-mind issues. I'm Paul Massari. After decades of increasing inequality and stagnating wages among working and middle-class Americans, many pundits thought that the financial crisis and the wave election of 2008 would usher in a new era of politics in the U.S. And they were right, only not the way they expected. The passage of the Affordable Care and Inflation Reduction Acts notwithstanding, the last 18 years have generally not yielded a more robust social safety net, higher taxes on the wealthy, or massive public investments in infrastructure or renewable energy. Instead, many working and middle-class voters have moved to the right, resulting most recently in sharp cuts to bedrock social programs that provide health care and food assistance to the poor, and equally sharp cuts in taxes, particularly for those at the top of the income pyramid. So why have U.S. politicians been unable to build sustained support for policies of redistribution in the face of skyrocketing inequality? Fair enough, a new book by social scientist Charlotte Cavaillé points to an underexamined cause: the complicated ways people think about fairness. In addition to traditional notions of self-interest, Cavaillé says voters weigh proportionality and reciprocity in deciding whether redistributive policies are fair. As a result, middle and working class Americans' concerns about free riders may inspire opposition to policies that would benefit them materially. Here to discuss her research and new book is Charlotte Cavaillé, formerly a visiting fellow at Princeton University's Center for the Study of Democratic Politics and an assistant professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Cavaillé's research examines the dynamics of popular attitudes towards redistributive social policies at a time of rising inequality, high fiscal stress, and high levels of immigration. She received her PhD in Government and Social Policy from Harvard Griffin GSAS in 2014. Charlotte Cavaillé, welcome to Colloquy.
Well, thanks for having me, Paul. It's great to be here.
So before we get to the cause, let's define the problem. How do you define economic inequality? How steeply has it risen over the last 25 or 50 years, so generation or two? And most of all, why does it matter?
Okay, so let's keep it simple, because there's big debates on what is inequality and how to measure it. We're just going to call it the uneven distribution of economic resources. And so usually we're thinking of two types of economic resources. One is income. It's a flow. It's the amount of cash you receive over a given period. The other one is wealth, which is if you were to sell everything you own, what would you get from the market, right, at a specific time? And so in terms of empirics, unfortunately, we don't have great wealth data. So a lot of the longitudinal data is about income. So we're going to stick to that for the moment. So how do we measure inequality? Well, let's take everyone who lives in a country in a given year. Let's talk about the United States. And so we're going to see how much income they receive over this period. And we're going to rank people from super poor to super rich, the person who gets the least to the person who gets the most. And then I'm going to cut this population into chunks. I'm going to take the bottom 10%, the poorest, the top 10%, the richest. And then I'm going to do the same thing the next year and the year after and the year after. And so I'm going to be comparing this top and this bottom, okay? So I'm not comparing the same people. I'm comparing same chunks of what we call the income distribution. So what has happened in the US? So inequality has risen in most what we call post-industrial democracies, usually starting in the late 70s actually, but kind of taking off in the 80s. The US is unique for something we call, I like to call it that way, it's called the fanning out pattern, which is the higher you go in the income distribution, the quicker the growth. So if I'm at the bottom, again, I'm comparing these bottom chunks. Actually, since the 70s, my average income went down, controlling for inflation, trying to adjust for all this, right? It went down, and then it kind of started growing. Not much, but 25% richer than in the today I'm about 25% richer on average for this group than in the 70s, 1978. If I take the middle, people who are, meaning they have half of the population that's richer than them, half that's poorer than them, didn't decline, it kind of stagnated, and then it grew at a similar rate. So now they're also kind of 25 to 30% richer than they were in the 70s. Again, we're not talking about the same people, we're talking about groups of people in similar positions in the income distribution. So now let's talk about the top 10%. They've had a much better time. What is unique is that not only are they doing better, but instead of the 10%, if we take the 1%, or if we take the 0.1%, the higher you go, the better they're doing. So for instance, the top 1%, they had an increase of basically 175%, I think is the number. So it doubled and more. If you go to the 0.1%, I don't have the numbers in mind, but I think last time I checked, it was something like 800% richer than in the 70s. So another way to think about this is if I take, for instance, the top 1%, back in the day, their income represented about 8% of total income generated that year. They had 1% of the population, 8% of income. Today, it's about 19%, okay? That is what makes income inequality quite unique in the US. It's this way in which the richer are getting richest faster. That is not observed in similar democracies.
The last part of the question that I asked you was, why does this matter? Why should we be concerned if even if you take into account the wealth transfers, the redistributions, the people on the bottom part of the income distribution are doing better than they were in the 1970s. Does it really matter that the people at the very top are doing so much better? What impact does that have on our economy, on our society?
It's usually my debate in my first class when I teach about these topics. So why should we care? Because usually conservatives would say, it's fine, like there's not been a big drop. Most people are earning a living. And by the way, you're not exactly comparing the same people. So if you do trace people over time, where does inequality fit into people's life experiences? The real one, when you take real people.
Right.
So I think there's three ways to think about this. You're exposed to information on this data that I just described that most people agree on. I would say 99% of people agree on. And it just shocks you from a moral perspective. You're usually on the left if you have that gut reaction. You bring a set of priors, you see this data, it can shock you for several reasons. One is there's no way these people are so much better than the rest of us that they deserve that much income. It's about, the size. Or you think they truly are despicable people. You could be in that category. Another reaction that's usually more common among economists, I call it the utilitarian reaction, is you say, I'm neutral, but it could have bad effects. And so there's a large research trying to document the effect on growth, the effect on democracy. And to be honest, I would argue that it's hard to assess because we don't have enough countries that have the kind of large inequality like the US that we could compare and contrast the US with. We have some evidence that the mechanisms that we should be worried about that are tied to high income inequality are there. But, someone who is not morally revolted at this data could also say, hey, the evidence from a utilitarian perspective is not that great. That's why some people don't worry about inequality. The third reason I would argue it's just from a pure scholarly perspective. Why is the US so different from other Western democracies? Why are we only seeing this in the US?
How do you define and really quantify in an accurate way the contributions that people make to a society or to an economy and to the value of the services or the products they create? So, if you're somebody in private equity, for instance, how do you gauge whether the contribution you make to the economy is greater than someone who's a surgeon or someone who's an EMT or something like that?
ultimately, every time we talk about an uneven distribution of an economic resource, we are bringing to the table some theory about what a just allocation or process of creation of these inequalities are. So it's inherently political.
Right. So in a sense, political economy is a redundant term. All economics are political.
Yes, and I think when economists say political economy, they just mean politics.
Right.
But it doesn't look good for them to study politics, so they do political economy.
So okay, I've been hectoring you with these side questions, but given the increase in inequality that you've described, one might expect an equally steep increase in support for redistributive policies like taxing the rich or strengthening the social safety net. So, what does the data actually show about attitudes in the US toward redistribution?
Okay, so before I tell you what the data shows, and it's imperfect data, but let me unpack this expectation that we should see this, right? Because to some extent, by saying we should, you're already implicitly assuming that anyone who looks at the data should be concerned for moral reasons, potentially for comparative reasons, or for consequential reasons. And so let's try to think about this. Let's start with the first one. Is you see the data, the evidence that this concentration of income and accumulation through wealth at the top. And you find this potentially morally highly problematic enough that it makes you want to change your opinions on the topic and potentially vote for someone who runs on this platform. So basically, under what condition would we see this increase is if we had a majority of the population who has that reaction. So then we have to explain, okay, who has that reaction? Well, let's just assume that people are rational, self-interested individuals. The people who should be most likely to have that reaction are people who either would not be hurt by an increase in redistribution. They're just enjoying a policy that is basically affecting a group that's not them and that they potentially feel envy or whatever towards. Or they could benefit, right? This money would be taxed and taken for public goods provision, for universal healthcare, for free education, etc. So for self-interested reason. So implicit in your question about we should see this is a sense that people should react to this increase in a way that they find it morally abhorrent, and that you have an implicit theory that it's tied to their self-interest. And so under what conditions should we see an increase if it's a majority of people would benefit from redistribution? Well, I think it is quite true in the US, in the sense, if we start taxing that, there's quite a lot. So the numbers, it's not going to save the deficit of the federal government, but there is quite a lot of, especially if you tax wealth. So there's big debate on if you just do an income tax or a wealth tax. We're not going to go in that debate, but let's assume that the conditions seem to be met. But there's another set of conditions also is you trust that your government, when they tax, they're going to actually implement a policy that benefits you. And so I think that the US is a bit different on these trust that the governments can do things. It's a large federal state. So things are decentralized. It's not always the same part of the government that helps you. So things get a little bit messy in the American context there. So I just want to caveat this about the conditions under which we expect this. So what do we see in the US? I can tell you that in most places, we don't see much movement. And the US is true on average. But the US is unique because while in other countries, things are pretty stable, there are some exceptions in the UK, and we can come back to it. But in the US, things are stable because it's hiding polarization. And so, of course, now polarization defines everything. The Democrats are becoming more pro-redistribution, and the Republicans are becoming more opposed. The problem with that general statement is that we only have one item on this topic that's been asked repeatedly since the 1970s. So you need to trust that this item is measuring something interesting. And so this item right now basically says, hey, to what extent do you fully agree with the fact that the government should redistribute wealth? To what extent do you think the government should not get into this business? And so right now you could say that nearly, I think when last time I looked, it was more than 40% of Democrats strongly agreed that the government should get involved in this. Versus, I think back in the 70s, we were closer to 20%, so it's more than doubled. For Republicans, they used to be 15, or again in the early 80s, 15, 16% strongly opposed basically really not wanting the government of business. Now they're closer to 35%. Okay. So there's still a good chunk of people somewhere in the middle, but now we've got quite a lot of people in these two extreme response categories, perfectly predicted by partisanship. So they cancel each other at the aggregate level, making it sound pretty flat.
Wow. So, okay, we've talked about the attitudes. Now let's talk about the why behind all of this. What does your research show about the forces that shape people's attitude toward redistribution?
Sure. So I started this book wanting to argue that the US was not so unique. So it's really a book about the US, but other countries. And actually a lot of my best data, because I'm trying to do longitudinal, I'm dependent on what other questions people have asked in the past. And the UK there is actually a pretty good place to look at attitudinal change over time. I have data from Germany, from France, Scandinavian countries, etc. So I think I was able to write a book that explains the US and Europe, but the US is pretty unique ultimately. So I'm going to tell you what I've learned on average about how people think about redistribution, and we can potentially talk about what's a little unique about the US. And so as a kind of first foray into what I'm arguing and trying to demonstrate in the book, you should think of people, they're thinking about redistribution in principle and in practice. So usually they might give you different answers depending on if you're asking them from what's your inclination towards this general principle of redistribution versus what about this policy? And two, they have what I call a self-interested leg and a moral leg, a fairness and a focusing leg. So the self-interest leg basically is like, oh, would I benefit from this? Would it hurt me? The moral leg is more, hey, if we implement this policy, would it move the world in a direction that feels good to me? It feels fairer. I'm contributing through my attitude to moving the status quo in a way where it feels better morally. So that's the kind of first two things. Then we need to understand under what condition they lean more on one leg or the other. So I'm happy to discuss about this. And we also need to understand, what do they mean by fairness?
Right. So that's my next question. People care about fairness as well as self-interested material benefits, but there's more than one way that they think about fairness. So what did you find?
So that, I would say, was the biggest finding for me. So there were two findings for me. One is that self-interest matters, but only in conditions where people understand the consequence of a policy. And that's actually common for some people and some policies, rare for others on specific policies. So for instance, rich people understand the tax code really well. Poor people understand welfare benefits much better than the tax code, okay? So like that kind of stuff, people are not stupid, but quote unquote, they're informed, but on policies that are important to them. So how do they think about things for all the times where they're not affected, they don't have time to invest in understanding the long-term implications for them of a policy? And that's where thinking in terms of fairness has really helped me. And so I think what I've also learned, so usually in the neck of the woods I'm in, we have this very basic understanding of fairness as, to what extent do I think that effort pays, right? So to what extent do I think that on average people get what they deserve because they worked for it? But I think the more I looked at the ethnography, I did a bit of focus group myself, I collected additional data, I think this concept of effort could mean very different things depending on what type of redistribution you're talking about and what does it affect. And so the best way to really try to synthesize 5 years of staring at the data and trying to fit things together is that they think about the fairness of policies that affect market income, which is income generated through a capitalist market-based process, and that's true in all capitalist countries, differently from how they think about the fairness of policies that pool resources to help others. So it can be unemployment insurance in Europe, it can be Medicare and Medicaid, it can be welfare, etc. Because they're not thinking about the fairness of markets, they're thinking about fairness of shared resources. Are we giving it to the right people? And I think what I've discovered, to my surprise a little bit, was that these two ways of thinking are actually need not be correlated. And in Europe, they're totally not correlated. In the US, a bit more.
So talk about that some more. You talk about in your book uh, policies that are redistribution from and policies that are redistribution to. So what's the difference between the two of them, and how do they play into these different ways of thinking about fairness?
Sure. So, so there's a debate with some of my colleagues on whether or not it was the most helpful way of describing these two, but they're helpful in the following sense. So, redistribution from is I'm taking money from someone, okay? So I'm taking away from. Redistribution to is I'm giving it to somebody. And so the policies that take are usually policies that interfere with market income, the creation of market income, either by literally taking it through taxation or, antitrust policies, you're basically trying to change the labor market in a way to make it more competitive, in a way that avoids some people to have a rent, et cetera. So you're basically interfering with how income is generated. So in that sense, I think that I call them redistribution from, because usually you're taking. You're preventing the accumulation of market income. And so they're shared by, and to simplify a little bit again, so back in the 80s, I would have told you it's something about to what extent you're a communist or not. So do you trust capitalism or not? So that's a stark distinction. I think that time is gone. Most people, don't see an alternative. And so within that is that, do you think the capitalist, quote unquote, rat race is fair or not? Most people think it's not perfectly fair, but the extent to which we think he deviates from this ideal type of the invisible and pure and perfect competition, that we're all culturally socialized. It's kind of interesting. Even people who didn't take econ understand what a fair market competition is, because that's our culture we're in. And so if you think the deviation is large, you're going to be much happier with redistribution from policies or policies that interfere to try to prevent the accumulation of, income among specific industries or individuals. So that's one type of fairness. Redistribution two is this one I told you about. It's more solidarity. It's about means-tested benefits, et cetera. And so there, again, what I discovered I didn't fully see coming is that people's perception of these policies is really shaped by whether or not they think free riding is high prevalence, whether or not they think, there's always going to be a little bit of abuse. And so abuse can be literally people who are cheating, claiming benefits they don't have access to. But for instance, in the French system, we all pay, as you might pick up on my accent, I'm French. We all pay into the unemployment system. So we have a right to then have an income when we're unemployed. But then the abuse is our brothers and sisters who decide to declare themselves unemployed and do an agreement with their employer to just go on vacation for a year on the benefits of this collective. So it doesn't always have to be about abuse, about a specific type of, the welfare queen stereotype, for instance, in the US. And so there, people's perceptions about the prevalence of free riding is not predicted, especially in Europe, by what they believe about the fairness of the rat race in the capitalist system. So let me give you one example. There's two ideal types that I find interesting. So the French president, Macron, was elected by a centrist electorate. They are usually much more likely to think capitalism works. And so the kind of policies they favor are more tweaking to make sure it's even more fair. However, they have no problems with the poor. So they look right-wing in that sense, right? They're pro-market. But they have no problems with the poor because they trust that there's not that much abuse. So they look left-wing when you ask them about welfare. On the other hand, you have far-right, what we call the traditional far right in Europe, who don't trust anybody, meaning they think capitalism is an unfair race and there's a lot of abuse. So sometimes they look right-wing when you ask them about welfare. Sometimes they look left-wing when you ask them about taxing the rich. In the US, a little different. And so I'm happy if you want to jump into that.
Yes, no. Tell me, how is it different in the US?
Yeah, so basically, remember, ultimately, this is a book trying to explain a lot of people that I couldn't interview, so I had to use survey data. So I'm explaining how people answer surveys. And so the US is unique in the following sense. First of all, historically, it's had only two political parties. And for reasons that requires another podcast, these two parties are very different. They've polarized. And so what you've seen is kind of, the US now is the most ideological country in the world, basically. The supply side of politics, the right-wing version of the fairness of markets is combined with the right-wing version of the fairness of social insurance, of solidarity. And the left-wing version of attitudes towards markets is combined with the left-wing version of social solidarity. These things are much more disjuncted in Europe because there are multiple parties that can present combinations of each, okay? And so in the US, when you're answering surveys, you're not just answering surveys using your own belief about specific policy, you're also, to some extent, reproducing these two bundles, right? And so in that sense, these two attitudes tend to be more correlated in the US than they are in Europe because of the way the polarized party system structures you to be kind of a consistent liberal and a consistent conservative. However, if you manage to get the right kind of data that doesn't prime partisanship too much, what I'm finding is that the best predictor of who is a Republican and who is a Democrat on redistributive issues is really attitudes that shape beliefs about the prevalence of the fairness of social solidarity, the prevalence of free riding. Again, it's not the perfect best part of the book because, again, I didn't have, basically, there's not that many questions on the fairness of capitalism because, you know, the US is overall a more right-wing country on these issues. But when it comes to what extent you think that taxes are used to help the deserving poor, all that kind of beliefs, they have polarized and they really predict whether or not you're a Republican or a Democrat.
You also say that self-interest trumps norms of fairness if it has a large and certain impact on a person's own living standards. And this was something that really sort of threw me in reading your book, because I thought, well, you know, the United States among Western, modern industrial developed countries is unique, for instance, in the relatively high level of medical bankruptcies. So something like universal single-payer health insurance, a system like they have, say, in France or in Canada, would have an immense impact on the finances of millions of people. So would public daycare. So would free public education through college. So if you have these programs that would have a real and measurable impact on the lives of millions of people, why haven't we been able to institute them?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So let me first tell you the example I had in mind when I kind of came up with this. So it was a claim that was found in the US and to some extent also in the UK that said poor people vote against their interests, you know, they go against policies that benefit them. And it's just not what I see in the data. So basically what I see in the data is that a lot of low-income people don't like, I'm going to call it welfare in broad terms. However, when you ask them, do you want to cut welfare? They say no, right? So in that sense, their self-interest kicks in. But you see here, it's about cutting welfare. It is easier to understand the consequences of taking something away than to bank on the benefits of something that could be implemented, especially in the US context where we haven't seen anything being implemented as such. Even Obamacare was this weird thing where you still had to go and spend money on a market because, of course, the American system is kind of unique in the amount of compromise that are built into it. So the UK, for instance, it's enough for one party to control Westminster and then they do whatever the hell they want, right? Not the case in the US. So the policy's there, it's the connection. It's easier to think about the future in the UK context. However, irrespective, it is always easier for a voter to think about the consequences of a loss of a policy than to think about the potential benefits of a future policy. And so it's all up to politicians to try to convince people that they're gonna follow through. And that kind of trust, I don't think exists in the US right now. But even when you look at the Great Depression period, some researchers went back and found public opinion data at the time. People were not trusting of what FDR was doing. There was no public opinion support in these polls. However, once these policies existed, it becomes hard to take off. That's why it's going to be interesting to see what some of the cuts to subsidies for healthcare, health insurance, what's going to happen when these fully kick in the current context.
So finally, reading your book, it struck me that it seems like the United States in particular is caught in a kind of vicious cycle where increasing inequality paradoxically increases, at least for some portion of the population, opposition to the redistributive policies that could ameliorate the inequality. Do you have a sense of how your research could inform the work of politicians and activists who want to break out of this cycle?
There's two ways to think about this. So given my model, you could try to have people put more weight on the self-interest leg. And so I'm actually reading finally LBJ's, the book on LBJ by Karen. I keep forgetting his last name. You know the...
Oh, Robert
Anyway,
Caro? Robert Caro.
there we go. Caro, there you go, sorry. And so I'm reading all about these farmers who are just asking for the government to come and help them. So there's one way for self-interest is you have a really bad recession and you're just waiting for the recession. Historically, the equivalent of extreme hardship combined with the successful portrayal of the rich as undeserving, to simplify, or capitalism having failed, it's called World War II, right, in France, combined with... So my extremely pessimistic answer is that historically, the perfect storm of having both legs working in the same direction that shapes people's fairness beliefs, especially on the taxation of market income, and a strong emphasis on the self-interest leg requires pretty scary disruption of the economy and of society in the form of a world war. And to some extent, redistribution has worked. You know, the pandemic, not everyone, like some people had a really hard time, but in terms of income, you know, redistribution kicked in, same in Europe. So there's a bit of a tension here that the research tells us you need hardship, but then we have enough redistribution that for the moment we're not reaching that kind of level of hardship. So in that sense, I'm not very optimistic because I don't think actually things should happen from the demand side. So don't just take people and try to convince them. It's more, what are the types of reforms, if that's the kind of goal you have in mind, that can start loosening the system in a way that in the long run, people's fairness beliefs would slowly change in a way more conducive to what you want. And right now, the biggest problem is this polarized two-party system that really gives little space for people to think. I don't know you do that. I don't know if it's a career goal to get rid of that system. Some Drutman at some of the think tanks, he's working hard on it, for instance. Is it the panacea? But I guess what my research shows is maybe focus on all these other bottlenecks, that there are policies that are specific policies that people like parental leave, actually, that are being blocked in Congress due to polarization, due to lobbying. Like, focus on that, leave people alone. You know, once the policy is close to passing, they'll realize it's good and they'll like it.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this has been Colloquy. This podcast is an extension of the school magazine of the same name. You can find a transcript of the show, as well as past episodes, at the Harvard Griffin GSAS website, gsas.harvard.edu/colloquy-podcast. If you enjoyed this interview, please rate the show on Apple or Spotify so that others can find it as well. And be sure to follow Harvard Griffin GSAS on YouTube so you'll never miss a conversation. Our theme music is from the Boston-based band Francine. I'm Paul Massari. See you next time.